Let's stay with Lincoln for a second, and one of the pieces is actually a combination of two, the Recollections of Lincoln by Henry Villard. First of all, who was Henry Villard? And secondly, he writes several times in these pieces about his offense, taking offense at the nature of President Lincoln's crude jokes.
Well, one of President Obama's observations about the photograph is that it compels you to see past the icon to the man and to recognize Lincoln's essential humanity, the strain the war had taken, that there was a real flesh and blood person behind this. And what I think we both love about that Villard piece is he does give you the man in full. Henry Villard was an AP reporter who covered the Lincoln-Douglas debates. And so he got to know Abraham Lincoln on the stump when Lincoln was an unknown one-term congressman from Illinois who'd come back now to run for Senate and compete with Douglas. And he sounds every bit the hard-bitten, veteran, jaded political reporter. His basic attitude is you hear one Lincoln-Douglas debate, you've heard them all. And his attitude toward Lincoln was, he says that Lincoln caused him humiliation and embarrassment. He was so coarse and uncouth. He told dirty jokes. He lied to get people out of his office. You could never pin him down on secession. That Lincoln was arguing for the preservation of the Union, but if you really pushed him on, well, what would you do about it? He wouldn't give you a straight answer.
No, it's great. I mean, and that's one of the great things about seeing history unfold in real time from the perspective of the journalists who were there. You tend to, from the perspective of 150 years later, Lincoln rightfully is on this enormous pedestal, and yet the reality was, day to day, he was having to engage in sort of all of the petty diplomacy and pettifogging that politicians today are. And my two favorite parts, I mean, I love the Villard portrait. He wrote it in 1902, right, reflecting back on having spent time with him in the late 1850s.
With a great deal of clarity, it seems. It's very sharp remembrances.
And it's fantastic. And as James says, he's offended and repeatedly says, this guy's the President of the United States, and he has this remarkable, almost uncontrollable propensity for making dirty jokes and bawdy comments, and he just seems unbecoming of a president. But
he does acknowledge, he says he turned out to be one of the great leaders of men in adversity. And he sort of completely misjudged it.
Completely. And there's one great quote where I think it's in actually it's before 1858, and he's talking about Lincoln at this point is just a state legislator aspiring maybe to become a congressman or a senator. And he says, my wife keeps thinking that I could be president of the United States. Can you believe a bumpkin like me, a sucker like me becoming the president? And this is Lincoln himself, speaking in the 1850s.
The moment Scott describes there is, again, it's just a wonderful anecdote, I think. He describes getting caught with Lincoln in a summer rainstorm and sheltering with him in a freight car. So he's just sitting with the man. He has no notion could ever be president of the United States. Hearing Lincoln laugh at the idea that he could have, that this is his wife's ambition for him. I sort of suspect, actually, that Lincoln is spinning Villard in that moment and saying, oh, my wife thinks I can be president. Of course, I have no such ambition myself. And it's another way that, as Scott says, you have this sense, I think, as you move through the issue of just how plastic this moment was in American history. And the nation was being formed, but also history could have gone in very, very different directions at every point. And also how modern so much of it feels, like the relationship of the writers to the subject, the actual politicians, the sort of their efforts to communicate, get their messages heard, a lot of very familiar types.
I mean, yeah, as